Welcome to Book Summary Podcast, your gateway to personal transformation. Each episode delivers big ideas from the world's most impactful books on mindset, productivity, and success, all in just a few minutes. Ready to turn knowledge into action? Let's get started.
Welcome. We are so glad you're joining us today for this deep dive. Let me ask you something right out of the gate.
Go for it.
Do you ever feel completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of information coming at you?
Oh, constantly.
Right, whether you're trying to figure out a career move, managing your investments, or just trying to navigate a world that seems increasingly complex and chaotic.
It really feels like we are constantly drowning in noise.
Exactly. We're sold a million different frameworks, life hacks, paradigms, and yet the overwhelm never really fades. So if you are nodding your head right now, I promise you, you are not alone.
You're definitely not alone.
And more importantly, you are exactly where you need to be today, because we are exploring what might just be the ultimate time-tested antidote to all of that modern noise.
We are indeed. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the mind of a man who built an unparalleled legacy. And he didn't do it by reacting frantically to the daily noise, but by ruthlessly, systematically cutting through it.
Yeah.
We are diving deep into the abridged 2023 Stripe Press edition of Poor Charlie's Almanack. Now, for those who might, categorize this as just another Wall Street finance book, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Not even close.
This is a profound, incredibly eclectic collection of biographical sketches, family memories, and most crucially, a series of speeches detailing the worldly wisdom of Charles T. Munger.
Charlie Munger. I mean, for decades, Warren Buffett has been the incredibly famous, folksy face of Berkshire Hathaway, but Munger was the architectural genius operating quietly in the background.
Very quietly.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are exploring the mind of a billionaire who operated completely differently from the frantic, hyperactive types you usually associate with high finance. Our mission today is to extract Munger's ultimate mental toolkit.
The Latticework?
Yes, we're going to explore how to build what he famously calls a latticework of mental models. It's essentially a blueprint for becoming fiercely rational in a world that often rewards irrationality.
What's fascinating here is the sheer, unapologetic breadth of Munger's approach. In the foreword to this beautifully produced Stripe Press edition, John Collison,
a co-founder of Stripe.
Right, Collison perfectly encapsulates this. He praises Munger's chutzpah and his heavily multidisciplinary mode of reasoning. Collison points out that Munger didn't just understand balance sheets.
Right.
He drew profound, actionable insights from mathematics, physics, history, evolutionary biology, and psychology.
It's all connected for him.
Exactly. Collison notes that the book serves as a refreshing rebuttal to conventional, specialized wisdom. It's delivered with unusual simplicity, a rather brutal candor. What we're really talking about is an operating system for clear thinking, utilizing fundamental principles that haven't changed in a century.
So to understand how someone builds an operating system like that, we really need to look at where this unique, almost militant rationality came from. The book paints a vivid picture of Munger's origins.
It really does.
He was born on January 1st, 1924 in Omaha, Nebraska. So he's growing up right in the middle of the Roaring '20s, but then his formative years hit a brick wall with the Great Depression. The contrast between the optimism of the 20s and the absolute crushing devastation of the 30s had to have left a massive imprint on how he viewed risks, right?
Unquestionably. You have to picture Omaha in that era. In the 1920s, it was this tight-knit Midwestern hub where people implicitly trusted one another's word.
A lot of handshake deals.
Business was almost exclusively done on a handshake. But then the 1930s hit, and the bottom fell out of the world. Young Charlie witnessed severe, unprecedented hardship.
Yeah.
He literally saw hobos roaming the streets of his neighborhood looking for handouts. He witnessed the absolute fragility of the macroeconomic system. But simultaneously, he saw how his own family, through extreme prudence and mutual support, managed to weather the storm.
There's that pivotal story about his grandfather.
A federal judge.
Right.
The judge rescued a small, struggling bank owned by Charlie's uncle. And he didn't do it with a government bailout.
No.
He did it by risking his own fundamentally sound assets to back up the bank's failing loans.
That is a massive personal risk to take in the middle of the Depression.
Exactly. And those early observations of catastrophic economic failure, juxtaposed with disciplined, calculated family resilience, forged a deep-seated conservatism in Munger's mind. It instilled an almost obsessive respect for what engineers call a margin of safety.
Like with building a bridge.
Precisely. You don't build a bridge to hold exactly the weight you expect. You build it to hold 5 times that weight, because the unexpected always happens.
And speaking of character-building experiences during the Depression, we have to talk about his first real job. Because there is a legendary connection here to the Buffett family, decades before he and Warren actually teamed up.
Oh, the grocery store.
Yeah, young Charlie got a job working at a place called Buffett & Son, which was an upscale grocery store in Omaha, and the boss was Warren Buffett's grandfather, Ernest. From what the book describes, Ernest was not exactly running a laid-back operation.
Laid back would be the absolute antithesis of Ernest Buffett. He was notoriously strict, a true product of his time. He scheduled these young kids for 12-hour shifts.
12 hours!
And we aren't talking about shifts with an hour for lunch and a couple of coffee breaks. It was 12 hours of continuous labor.
Wow.
Furthermore, Ernest was fiercely anti-socialist. When the Social Security Act was passed, he didn't just quietly comply.
He made a whole production out of it.
He forced the boys, including young Charlie, to physically hand over 2 pennies from their hard-earned $2 daily wage to cover their share of the tax.
2 pennies.
And he would deliver a stern, impassioned lecture on the evils of socialism and the dangers of relying on the government while he collected those pennies.
It's just brutal. $2 for 12 hours of work, and you still get a lecture while handing over your pennies. But you can see the thread starting to pull through his life, right? Both Charlie and Warren served hard time under Grandpa Ernest, learning an undeniable work ethic.
It built a foundation.
It did. But the book also highlights that Munger was intensely curious outside of that grueling work. He was a voracious reader as a kid, obsessed with the biographies. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, became his lifelong hero. And he had this incredibly quirky hobby.
The hamsters.
Yes, breeding and trading hamsters with the neighborhood kids. He apparently ran this massive operation in his basement.
He did. And it wasn't just a pet hobby. It was early market trading. Even as a child, he showed this incredible, sagacious negotiating ability. He was always trading up.
What do you mean?
Figuring out how to exchange a standard hamster for a larger one, or one with unusual coloring that he knew another kid wanted more. He was instinctively learning about perceived value, liquidity, and arbitration.
That is hilarious.
He ended up with something like 35 hamsters in the basement until the smell became so overpowering that his mother finally shut the entire operation down.
I love that. A master capital allocator shut down by his mom because of the smell. But his trajectory shifts drastically as he gets older. He enrolls at the University of Michigan to study mathematics and physics, but World War II breaks out. He drops out to enlist in the Army Air Corps, and they send him to Caltech to train as a meteorologist. Now, normally, being a weatherman in the military doesn't sound like the origin story of a financial genius.
It might not sound like it, but that training at Caltech is arguably one of the most crucial, often overlooked pieces of the Munger puzzle. Think about what meteorology actually is. It is the science of extraordinarily complex dynamic systems.
You mean as opposed to something linear, like building a clock?
Precisely. In classical mechanics, if you push a lever with a specific amount of force, you know exactly what the output will be. It's deterministic.
A causes B.
Right. But weather doesn't work that way. Meteorology is about shifting probabilities, interacting variables, and recognizing patterns within highly chaotic environments. You can never predict a storm's exact path with 100% certainty.
But you can get close.
If you understand the underlying thermodynamic forces, pressure gradients, moisture content, temperature shifts, you can make highly accurate, probabilistic forecasts. This rigorous early exposure to complex systems permanently wired Munger's brain.
It changed how he saw everything.
It taught him to look at human behavior, global economies, and financial markets, not as simple, linear machines, but as interconnected, dynamic ecosystems.
That makes a lot of sense. The stock market is much more like a hurricane than a clock.
Very much so.
So after the war, he manages to get into Harvard Law School without even having an undergraduate degree, which is wild. He graduates magna cum laude, moves out to California, starts a successful law practice, and then the story takes a deeply tragic turn. This is the part of the book that really forces you to pause.
Yes, it is very heavy.
In the 1950s, he goes through a divorce, which was carrying a huge social stigma at the time. And shortly after, he learns that his 9-year-old son, Teddy, has leukemia. We have to remember this was an era before bone marrow transplants or advanced chemotherapy. It was a guaranteed death sentence.
There was nothing they could do.
The imagery in the book of a 29-year-old Charlie Munger walking the streets of Pasadena crying because he knows he is entirely powerless to save his son. It's incredibly heartbreaking.
It is entirely heartbreaking. And from a psychological standpoint, this is a defining crucible. A tragedy of that magnitude, compounded by the isolation of a recent divorce, could easily break a person.
Most people would break.
It could send them into a downward spiral of despair, or turn them deeply, permanently bitter against the world. But Munger's reaction, processed over time, seemed to be a retreat into and an ultimate militant reliance on objective reality.
He didn't hide from it.
No, he refused to let emotion permanently cloud his judgment, even in the face of the universe's ultimate unfairness. He learned to look at the absolute worst that life could offer without flinching or seeking false comfort. It forged an extreme rationality and a psychological resilience that defined every decision he made for the rest of his life. He later remarried a woman named Nancy Borthwick. They blended their families and eventually had 8 children together.
And the way he raised those 8 children is fascinating because he clearly applied that extreme rationality to his parenting. It wasn't your standard 1950s sitcom household.
Far from it. He used the family dinner table as his primary classroom. But he didn't use standard fairy tales to teach morality. He favored a very specific pedagogical tool that his daughter Wendy fondly calls the downward spiral tales.
Right. Instead of telling stories about good people getting rewarded, he would invent these horrific apocalyptic stories. He'd describe someone making a seemingly small but terrible ethical or financial choice, and then map out the catastrophic, inevitable ruin that followed.
And the kids would be groaning and laughing because the examples were so vividly extreme.
So vivid.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is our first real glimpse into Munger's obsession with inversion. He deeply believed in learning through vivid, negative examples. It's much easier to avoid stupidity than it is to achieve unassailable brilliance.
That makes total sense.
But beyond the stories, he was incredibly demanding regarding personal responsibility and reliability. There is a defining story from his stepson, Hal. They were vacationing at a lake in Minnesota, and Hal accidentally dropped a single set of car keys into 5 feet of murky, muddy lake water.
And most parents would sigh, use the spare key, and maybe dock the kid's allowance.
Not Munger. He didn't yell, but he certainly didn't coddle him. He simply told Hal to go out with his friends, start diving, and not to come back to the house without the keys.
Oh, man.
Hal spent 2 grueling hours diving into muddy water as the sun was setting, feeling around in the muck until he finally found that glint of metal. Now, to modern sensibilities, that might sound harsh, but the lesson in absolute accountability, that your mistakes are yours to fix no matter how unpleasant, was permanently etched into that young man's mind.
It definitely builds character, or at least a healthy fear of dropping things. And he also had this distinct philosophy on durability, which he forced onto his kids. His son Philip recalls Munger taking him to buy suits, but Munger wasn't interested in what was fashionable.
He hated fleeting trends.
He admired institutions and merchandise that were durable, traditional, and fairly priced. He bought Philip these incredibly stiff, traditional Brooks Brothers suits. Philip once got a gift card and tried to buy a pair of pleated trousers, which were stylish at the time, and Munger just stared at him and asked, "Do you want to look like a jazz drummer?"
That disdain for fleeting trends perfectly illustrates his approach to investing later on. Why buy something that will be out of style or obsolete in 3 years? But perhaps the most telling family anecdote is the Rushmore moniker.
Yes, tell us about Rushmore.
When Munger was deep in thought, whether he was reading a dense biography or poring over complex financial listings, he was completely, entirely oblivious to his surroundings. He built a mental fortress.
Nothing could distract him.
His 8 kids could be roughhousing, the television could be blaring, chaos could be erupting in the living room, and he wouldn't even flinch. His family literally nicknamed him Rushmore because he was as immovable, deaf, and silent as the granite monument in South Dakota. That level of physical embodiment of focus, the ability to selectively tune out all external noise, is a massive component of his intellectual success.
But he wasn't completely detached. He also taught intense loyalty. There's the story of him driving his son, Charlie Jr., to the airport. They were rushing to catch a plane, driving a red Audi Fox that Munger had borrowed from a friend. They are pressed for time, and the tank is still half full.
Most people would just park it and run for the terminal.
But Munger took a 10-minute detour to find a gas station and fill it up completely. He looked at his son and said, "Charlie, when you borrow a man's car, you always return it with a full tank of gas." And the amazing part is his son remembered that. Years later in college, Charlie Jr. topped off a borrowed car for a friend, And that small act of reliability cemented a lifelong friendship. Munger wasn't just teaching etiquette. He was teaching the mechanics of how to build lasting human capital.
Which brings us perfectly to the foreword written by Warren Buffett in this almanac. Buffett compares Charlie to their mutual hero, Ben Franklin. But Buffett notes a crucial, terrifying difference. Charlie demanded far more rigor than Franklin ever did.
He raised the bar.
Buffett writes that if Ben said to save pennies, Charlie raised the stakes. If Ben said be prompt, Charlie said be early. Buffett jokes that life under Franklin's rules looked positively cushy compared to Munger's ascetic rigor, but Buffett also outlines his own 3 rules for choosing a partner.
What were they?
He says, you should look for someone smarter and wiser than you, someone who will never sulk over expensive mistakes, and someone who adds to the fun in the journey. He says Charlie fit that bill slavishly.
Okay, so we have a clear picture of man. He's incredibly resilient, intensely focused, rigorously ethical, and demands excellence while avoiding failure at all costs. But how does a personality type translate into an actual replicable system for making complex decisions? Because he has this very specific phrase he uses. He talks about needing a latticework. What exactly is happening in his brain when a problem hits his desk?
This is the absolute core of Munger's entire philosophy. He posits a central thesis that is devastating to traditional education. You simply cannot truly know anything or solve complex problems by just remembering isolated facts and trying to bang them back on a test.
Rote memorization doesn't work.
If facts don't hang together on a conceptual latticework of theory in your head, you do not have them in a usable form.
So he's attacking the way we are all taught in school.
Fiercely. He argues that academia completely fails us because it balkanizes reality. It divides the world into strict, deeply defended territorial departments. You study economics over here, you study psychology in a different building, and you study physics somewhere else. The professors rarely talk to each other.
They stay in their silos.
But Munger insists that real-world problems don't respect academic boundaries. To be effective, you absolutely must jump those jurisdictional boundaries. He believes a fully formed intellect needs about 80 to 90 fundamental models drawn from multiple, diverse disciplines.
And if you don't have them?
If you don't, you fall victim to the old proverb. To the man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If your only mental model is classical economics, you will try to solve every human resource problem, every marketing problem, and every operational problem with an economic theory, even when it's clearly a psychological or engineering issue. You will torture reality to fit your limited toolkit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He uses the game of contract bridge to explain this, right? Now, I don't play bridge, but the analogy makes perfect sense.
It's a brilliant analogy. In contract bridge, there are a limited number of standard methods to win tricks. You have long suit establishment, finesses, throw-in plays, cross roughs, and squeezes.
Lots of different tools.
Exactly. If you sit down at the table and you only know how to execute a finesse, but the hand requires a cross rough, you are going to lose. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how hard you try. Life, Munger argues, is exactly the same. You need multiple models, and you need to understand how they interact.
So what are the models we need? He highlights specific disciplines you must master, and he starts with math, which honestly might make some people listening cringe, but he says that without basic mathematical fluency, specifically the elementary math of permutations and combinations, you are going through life like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest.
That is classic, unfiltered Munger phrasing right there. But he isn't demanding everyone become a calculus professor. He's talking about the basic probabilities developed by Fermat and Pascal. And what's crucial is that he explains why math is so difficult for the average person. He points out a biological, evolutionary reason.
Oh, because our brains weren't designed for it.
Exactly. Our ancestors' brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years on the savannah. We evolved to throw spears, recognize predators hiding in the brush, and run around corners. We did not evolve to calculate differential equations or instinctively grasp the nonlinear curve of compound interest.
We just aren't wired for it.
Because these mathematical concepts are completely unnatural to our genetic programming, we're terrible at them intuitively. Therefore, we have to consciously, painfully force ourselves to learn and utilize mental habits like decision trees.
He actually points out that mankind had to invent workarounds for this biological weakness, didn't he?
Yes, the graph. He notes that monks in the Middle Ages invented the value line graph. Why? Because the human brain can process motion and shape instantly, but struggles with raw numerical data. The graph translates abstract math into a visual shape, bypassing our cognitive limitations. It's a tool to overcome our biology.
But he doesn't stop at math. He leans heavily on engineering and physics. He loves the engineering concepts of backup systems and breakpoints. Like, an engineer never designs a system to work perfectly without a failsafe. If you apply that to your personal finances, it means always having an emergency fund, because the primary system, your job, might fail.
A margin of safety again.
Right. He loves the physics concept of critical mass. And then he stresses the absolute necessity of accounting. He calls it the language of practical business life. But, and this is a huge but, he comes with a massive warning about accounting.
Right. Accounting is essential, but you have to deeply understand its limitations. It is only a crude approximation of reality. It can easily be manipulated or simply fail to capture the true dynamics of a business. And this leads Munger to one of those illuminating stories in the entire Almanack, the story of Karl Braun.
I want to spend some time on this because it blew my mind. Who was Karl Braun and what did he do?
Karl Braun was the founder of the C.F. Braun Engineering Company. They designed and built massive, incredibly complex oil refineries. Braun was a brilliant, highly disciplined Germanic man. He looked at standard accounting practices, declared them utterly asinine for his specific needs in building refineries, threw out his traditional accountants, and forced his engineers to invent a totally new, proprietary accounting system from scratch.
But the accounting isn't even the best part of the Braun story. It's his rule for communication.
Correct. Braun instituted what we can call the 5 Ws rule. He demanded that every single directive, every memo, and every letter in his company explicitly answer who, what, where, when, and most importantly, why.
And he enforced this mercilessly. If you wrote a directive telling a subordinate to do something, but you didn't tell them why they were doing it, you could get fired. In fact, Munger notes that if you did it twice, you absolutely would get fired. Think about how wild that is. Firing a potentially brilliant engineer just for forgetting to explain the reason behind an instruction. So what does this all mean? Why was the why so critically important to Braun and, by extension, Munger?
This raises an important question about fundamental human psychology. Braun figured out a psychological truth before the psychologists did. Giving a reason, even if it seems blindingly obvious to the person giving the order, dramatically increases compliance, understanding, and execution quality.
It changes how they approach the task.
If you tell a worker why they are tightening a valve, because if you don't, the pressure will build and the refinery will explode, they conceptualize the task differently. They consider it vital. They don't just go through the motions. It ties back entirely to Munger's philosophy. Humans think better and retain information better if they array knowledge on a latticework that is essentially answering why.
So let's extrapolate that for a second. If someone listening is, say, a mid-level manager or a marketer today, how do they actually use this multidisciplinary lattice work? Are they supposed to consult a physics textbook before launching a social media campaign?
Not literally reading a textbook every time, no. But they should absolutely use the concepts. Let's take your marketer example. A marketer usually relies on demographic data and basic psychology. But what if they apply the physics model of thermodynamics?
Thermodynamics in marketing.
Yes. Thermodynamics teaches us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred, and that transferring energy always involves some loss, entropy. A marketer could look at their customer acquisition funnel and realize that every time they force a customer to click a new link or fill out a form, they are introducing friction, or entropy. They are losing energy in the system.
That makes total sense.
Or they could look at evolutionary biology. Humans are hardwired to conserve calories and attention. Therefore, any marketing message that requires heavy cognitive load will be biologically rejected. By combining biology, physics, and marketing, they design a vastly superior campaign than someone just looking at click-through rates.
That is exactly how Munger operates. It's fascinating that Braun figured out that psychological trigger, which brings us to Munger's biggest, most complex target. We've talked about math, physics, and engineering. But Munger firmly believes that the most critical, most dangerous, and most misunderstood models come from psychology. Why does he think our brains are so dangerous to us?
Munger states unequivocally that the human brain's evolutionary shortcuts cause massive systemic cognitive dysfunction in the modern world. We are incredibly easy to manipulate because our perceptual and cognitive apparatus is flawed by design.
We're running on old hardware.
Exactly. We use heuristics, which are mental shortcuts, to make fast decisions. Those shortcuts kept us alive in the jungle, but lead us into terrible traps in a complex economy.
But he doesn't just critique human nature. He heavily critiques the academic field of psychology itself, doesn't he?
He does, and he aligns himself with thinkers like the semanticist and cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker. Munger argues that traditional psychology textbooks are often daft. Why? Because for a long time, they completely ignored obvious biological Darwinian programming. They treated the brain as a blank slate.
Ignoring evolution entirely.
Even worse, Munger argues they completely miss or underplay crucial, undeniable human drivers. Things like envy, psychological denial, and what he considers the most powerful force of all, incentive-caused bias. Munger argues it is impossible to understand human behavior without recognizing the fundamental rule that what a person wishes, that also will they believe, especially if their paycheck depends on it.
To illustrate how even the most brilliant minds can be completely blinded, he uses the example of Noam Chomsky. Now, I want to be very clear for everyone listening. We aren't taking any political sides here. We're just reporting what Munger observed about ideology in the source material. Munger acknowledges that Chomsky is a certified genius in linguistics. But Munger argues that Chomsky's deep, egalitarian, leftist ideology blinded him to the obvious Darwinian truths about language being deeply buried in the human genome.
Right. The ideology becomes a filter.
Exactly. And look, we all have our political leanings, right?
Right.
But Munger uses Chomsky to make a broader point about the sheer, destructive danger of heavy ideology.
Munger learned from his father, and Warren Buffett learned from his, to avoid extreme political or social ideologies like the plague. Because ideology literally locks the brain into distorted patterns. When you adopt a heavy ideology, you start with a conclusion, and you torture all incoming reality to fit that conclusion.
You work backwards from what you want to be true.
Munger warns that if ideology can screw up a certified genius like Chomsky, imagine what it does to the average person trying to make rational decisions. It turns your brain into a cabbage.
So individual biases are bad enough, but where psychology gets truly dangerous, according to Munger, is a phenomenon he coined the Lollapalooza Effect. What exactly is that?
The Lollapalooza Effect is Munger's term for what happens when multiple psychological forces, biases, or tendencies operate simultaneously in the exact same direction. When this happens, the result isn't just linear. It isn't 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's exponential.
It creates a wave.
It creates an overwhelming, often irrational result that is incredibly difficult to resist.
And he deconstructs a very famous psychological study to prove this. We all know the Milgram experiment from Psych 101, right? The setup where normal, decent people were brought into a lab and told by a guy in a white coat to deliver what they thought were increasingly severe electrical shocks to a person in the next room, and shockingly, most of them did it, even when the person was screaming. The standard textbook explanation is just authority. People obey men in lab coats. But Munger says the textbooks completely miss the point.
He calls the authority explanation mere first conclusion bias. The professors found one answer that made sense and stopped thinking. Munger argues they failed because they didn't use a simple checklist like a pilot does before takeoff. If you systematically check the psychological forces at play in Milgram's lab, you see it wasn't just authority. It was a massive Lollapalooza effect of at least 6 combined principles.
Walk us through the checklist. What else was happening?
First, you had the consistency tendency. The subjects had already agreed to help with the experiment, so they wanted to be consistent with their initial commitment. Second, you had social proof. The environment was highly structured to suggest that this is what normal people do in this setting.
They were just following the script.
Third, you had operant conditioning. The experimenter was giving them constant incremental feedback and pacing. Fourth, you had severe incentive-caused bias. They were being paid to be there. And humans have a deep reluctance to disappoint someone paying them. Munger argues that failing to see all these interacting forces is a profound failure of the psychological profession to understand its own subject matter.
That is fascinating. It's not just one string pulling you, it's a whole web. But he also dives deeply into the moral implications of this. If we know humans are this susceptible to incentives and systems, what happens when we build bad systems? He uses the example of California's workers' compensation system to explain this.
Yes. Munger argues that if you create a system that is very easy to cheat, you aren't just losing money, you are committing a great moral injury to civilization. In California's workers' comp system at the time, fraudulent claims became incredibly rampant because the system practically invited it. He compares it to operant conditioning with lab rats. You pull the lever, you get the cheese. If people cheat, and they instantly get rewarded with free money, and then they see all their friends and neighbors doing it, which triggers social proof, you inevitably turn otherwise decent, hardworking citizens into crooks.
The system dictates the morality.
Precisely. To contrast California, Munger tells the story of a friend who owned a manufacturing plant in Texas. He was facing massive workers' comp fraud that was bleeding his company dry. So what did he do? She didn't hire more lawyers. He moved the entire plant to a community of deeply believing Mormons in Utah.
He changed the environment entirely.
He moved to a place where the local culture and religious ethics eliminated the psychological slop and cheating culture. And instantly, his workers' comp costs dropped to 2% of payroll. The environment changed the behavior completely.
Okay, so that's how a bad system corrupts. But how can we use psychology constructively? There is a brilliant historical example he uses involving Captain James Cook. Tell us about the sauerkraut trick.
This is a masterclass in applied psychology. In the days of long sailing voyages, scurvy was a horrifying, deadly disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Whole crews would die. Captain Cook noticed that Dutch ships seemed to have less scurvy, and he realized they ate a lot of sauerkraut. So he decided to stock his English ships with tons of it. But there was a massive problem.
The sailors.
English sailors were a tough, violently stubborn bunch. They hated sauerkraut. They wanted their standard rations of salted beef and hardtack. Cook knew that if he simply used his authority and ordered them to eat it, he risked a full-blown mutiny.
So what did he do? He couldn't force them.
He used psychology. Cook set up a dining table where the ordinary sailors could plainly see the officers eating. And for a long period, he served the sauerkraut only to the officers.
That is so devious.
It's brilliant. He simultaneously triggered the psychological force of social proof. The men saw the leaders eating it, and the force of scarcity. The men saw a resource that was being denied to them. Eventually, the psychological pressure built up so much that the sailors were practically begging for the sauerkraut.
It totally reversed the dynamic.
Finally, Cook graciously allowed the men to have it one day a week. He manipulated them completely, yes, but he cured scurvy on his ships and saved their lives by understanding how their brains actually worked.
Now contrast Captain Cook's success with a massive modern business failure that Munger highlights. Let's talk about the Salomon Brothers scandal, because this shows what happens when highly educated people ignore psychology completely.
This is a pivotal story. In the early 1990s, the general counsel of the investment bank Salomon Brothers discovered that a trader was committing serious improprieties. The lawyer went to the CEO, John Gutfreund, and tried to convince him to report the trader to the authorities. But the lawyer relied entirely on morality. He basically said, "John, it's the right thing to do. We have an ethical obligation." And it completely failed. Gutfreund put it off because confronting the star trader was unpleasant, and he hoped it would just go away.
Which eventually led to a massive scandal that almost destroyed the firm. Why did the lawyer fail?
Munger points out that the lawyer blew it because he didn't understand psychology. He ignored incentive-caused bias. He should have appealed to interest, not just morality. Munger says that the lawyer had walked in and said, "John, this situation is a ticking time bomb. If you don't act now, it will ruin your life, strip you of your wealth, and destroy your legacy forever." Gutfreund would have acted instantly.
But doesn't that sound a bit cynical, treating everyone as purely self-interested?
It might sound cynical, but Munger argues it is simply objective reality. Understanding psychology isn't a dark art. It is absolutely crucial for achieving ethical outcomes in the real world. If you want people to do the right thing, you have to align the incentives with the right action.
This raises an important question, though, which Munger himself acknowledges. Once you understand all these psychological levers, social proof, scarcity, incentive bias, what are the ethical limits of using them to manipulate people, like Captain Cook did?
Munger is very clear on this. He warns that you must primarily use this knowledge defensively. You learn the Lollapalooza effect so you can protect yourself from being manipulated by salespeople, politicians, or toxic corporate cultures. And if you do use it to influence others, you must do so cautiously and ethically, ensuring that the outcome is actually in their best interest, like curing scurvy, rather than just enriching yourself.
Okay, so we've covered his grueling childhood, his multidisciplinary lattice work, and his deep dive into the flaws of the human brain. But how do Munger and Buffett actually apply all of this to make billions of dollars? Because at the end of the day, they are investors. Let's look at how they approach the market.
The absolute foundation of Munger's applied wisdom in investing is his utter rejection of the efficient market hypothesis. For decades, this was the dominant academic theory taught in business schools. It claims that the stock market is perfectly efficient.
Meaning everything is priced exactly right.
Yes, that prices instantly reflect all available public information, and therefore it is mathematically impossible to consistently beat the market. Munger calls this theory, quite bluntly, bonkers.
So if he doesn't believe the market is perfectly efficient, what mental model does he use to explain it?
He uses a model from the racetrack. the pari-mutuel system.
I love this analogy. Explain how the stock market is like a horse track.
In a pari-mutuel betting system, you aren't betting against the house. You're betting against all the other bettors. The odds change based on where the money is placed. Munger points out that any fool can look at a racing form and see that a fast horse with a great record carrying a lightweight is far more likely to win than a slow, injured horse. But the odds reflect that. The fast horse pays 3-2, and the bad horse pays 100-1.
So in that sense, the market is somewhat efficient.
Yes, it is incredibly hard to beat, especially when you factor in the track's 17% take, which in the stock market equates to frictional costs, trading fees, and taxes. But here is Munger's crucial caveat. The market is somewhat efficient, but is not perfectly efficient. Human beings are emotional. They panic. They get greedy. Therefore, mispriced bets occasionally happen.
So what is the strategy? Do you bet on every race?
Absolutely not. Munger's strategy is extreme patience combined with extreme decisiveness. A smart bettor ignores the daily noise, studies the performance, and waits patiently. You might sit and do nothing for years. But when you finally see a mispriced bet, a fast horse paying 10-1 because the crowd is irrationally panicked and is deeply within your circle of competence, you don't bet a little bit.
You go all in.
You load up. Munger famously advocates for what he literally calls sit-on-your-ass investing.
Which is the complete polar opposite of what modern Wall Street does. Especially today, with algorithmic high-frequency trading and apps pushing people to trade options every 5 minutes, Munger tells this great joke about a fishing tackle salesman to illustrate why Wall Street wants you trading constantly. Do you remember that one?
I do. A guy walks into a tackle shop, sees these wild, incredibly complex neon purple and green lures, and asks the salesman, "Do fish really take these crazy lures?" And the salesman replies, "Mister, I don't sell to fish. I sell to fishermen."
Exactly. Munger says standard investment managers and brokers are the same as that salesman. They sell the illusion of constant activity, complex diversification, and hyperactive trading because that's what anxious clients want to buy. And that is how managers justify their massive fees. But all that constant trading actually destroys your wealth.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of wealth accumulation, Munger lays out the inescapable map of why sitting on your ass is so mathematically powerful. He explains the massive, often ignored advantage of deferred taxes.
Let's run the math on that because it's eye-opening.
Let's say you buy a genuinely great company and it compounds at 15% annually. If you hold it for 30 uninterrupted years and you only pay a 35% capital gains tax at the very end when you finally sell, your net annualized return after taxes is around 13.3%. Now imagine you get that same 15% return, but you actively trade it.
Buying and selling every year.
Exactly. Paying that 35% tax annually, your net return drops to under 10%. Over 30 years, the person who sat on their hands has drastically more wealth. The tax system heavily, disproportionately rewards the patient, inactive investor.
Okay, but sitting on your ass only works if you are sitting on a great company. If you sit on a terrible company, you just watch it go to zero slowly. So how does Munger define a great company? What models does he use there?
He relies heavily on microeconomics, specifically analyzing the structural advantages of scale. He looks for companies that have built what Warren Buffett calls a moat, an unreachable competitive advantage. For example, he talks about Procter & Gamble.
They got massive very quickly.
In the early days of television, P&G sold so much volume that they were one of the only companies that could afford massive national network TV advertising. This created an incredible feedback loop. They advertise nationally, sell more soap, get richer, and buy more ads. It effectively shut small competitors out of the market entirely. He also points to Coca-Cola's unparalleled worldwide distribution system. Once you achieve that scale, it is almost impossible for a startup to dislodge you.
But scale isn't always good, right? Munger warns heavily about the dark side of getting too big.
He does. He constantly weighs the advantages of scale against the curse of bureaucracy. As organizations grow into massive empires, they inevitably tend to become bloated, sluggish, and somewhat corrupt. He uses the CBS television network under William Paley as a prime historical example. Paley was so powerful, and the network was so dominant, that employees became terrified of him.
People only told him what he wanted to hear.
He lived in a cocoon of unreality, and as a result, the company made terrible, value-destroying acquisition decisions because the internal feedback loop was broken by bureaucratic fear.
So you want scale, but you have to fight bureaucracy. Munger is also obsessed with this concept of competitive destruction and what he calls surfing.
Yes, the technological wave. He uses the story of National Cash Register and its founder, John Henry Patterson. Patterson owned a small retail store. He bought a crude, early model of a cash register and immediately saw that it stopped his employees from stealing from him. But instead of just using it, he had a massive insight.
He looked at the big picture.
He realized the cash register itself was a vastly superior business to retail. He bought the company, caught the wave of this new technology, and surfed it brilliantly by hoarding patents and building an aggressive sales force.
But wait a minute. If he loves the idea of catching technological waves, why does Berkshire Hathaway historically avoid technology stocks? Everyone knows they didn't buy Microsoft or Google early on.
This is perhaps the greatest masterclass in intellectual humility in the entire book. Munger openly, comfortably admits that picking the winners in complex, rapidly shifting technology sectors is simply outside their circle of competence. They don't have a special engineering background, and they don't know who will win the AI war or the microchip war.
They know what they don't know.
So rather than gamble, they simply refuse to play the game. They'd much rather stick to deeply understandable, low-tech businesses like candy, razor blades, or insurance, where the underlying economics won't change in 20 years.
And their understanding of basic economics leads to some incredible counterintuitive insights. Let's deconstruct the textile loom story because I think it perfectly illustrates Munger and Buffett's second-order thinking. Berkshire Hathaway actually started as a struggling New England textile mill.
Right. And one day, the managers come to Warren Buffett, extremely excited. They say, "Warren, they've invented a new highly advanced textile loom. If we buy these machines, it will double our productivity overnight."
And what did Buffett say?
Buffett's response was, "I hope this doesn't work, because if it does, I'm going to close the mill."
Now, to a normal manager, that makes zero sense. Double productivity is supposed to be amazing. Why would he want to close the mill?
What's fascinating here is the underlying second-order economic logic. Buffett and Munger knew that textiles were a terrible, completely undifferentiated commodity business. A towel is a towel. If a new, highly efficient machine is invented, every competing mill will eventually buy it. The cost of production will drop across the entire industry.
And prices will drop with it.
Exactly. Because it's a hyper-competitive commodity market, the prices charged to consumers will drop by the exact same amount. The massive capital investment required to buy those expensive new looms would yield absolutely zero extra profit for the owners. All the financial benefits of the innovation would flow entirely to the consumers buying the textiles. So rather than sink millions of dollars of capital into a bad business just to tread water against competitors, they extracted the capital, shut down the mills, and bought better businesses.
That is just brilliant capital allocation. And sometimes they buy businesses that are a total mess, but apply what Munger calls the cancer surgery model. Jayco is the famous example of this.
Yes. In the 1970s, Jayco was on the verge of bankruptcy. But Munger and Buffett saw that buried underneath the mess was a perfectly magnificent, structurally advantaged auto insurance business. The crisis was caused by management engaging in foolish expansions and bad underwriting decisions. So they didn't try to invent a new paradigm, they just acted like ruthless surgeons. They cut out all the toxic, foolish parts of the business, fired the people who made the mistakes, and simply let the perfectly healthy core business thrive again. It's an incredibly simple model, but very rare in the ego-driven corporate world.
They're always looking for those fundamental, unshakable strengths, like the power of a brand or a trademark. The book has this hilarious, almost mafia-like story about the Carnation Fish Company.
It perfectly demonstrates the sheer power of an entrenched trademark. Carnation, the massive evaporated milk company, discovered a guy operating a small fish packing plant who had legally registered the trademark Carnation Fish. The massive milk company obviously wanted to buy the trademark to protect their brand name, but the guy refused to sell. He kept raising his price.
It was extorting them.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Eventually, the big Carnation executives were so terrified that this guy might produce a batch of rotten fish and cause a botulism outbreak under the Carnation name that they made a crazy deal. They agreed to provide free, high-level, corporate quality control for his tiny fish plant, completely at their own expense, just to ensure he didn't ruin their brand. It demonstrates the extreme, almost extortionate power of a deeply entrenched mental shortcut in the consumer's mind.
Or look at what he calls the autocatalysis of Disney. This is another great mental model. When video cassettes were invented, Disney didn't have to spend a dime developing the VCR technology, and they didn't have to shoot new films. They just took decades of animated classics out of the vault, put them on VHS, and made billions of dollars of pure profit. Munger described it as a duck sitting on a pond, and someone else raised the level of the pond. They caught a massive technological tailwind simply because of the assets they already held in their circle of competence.
If we pause and connect this sit on your ass and wait for a fat pitch philosophy to our modern world, it provides a radical, deeply necessary counter-narrative. Today, we're infected by hustle culture. We are constantly told to grind, to pivot, to iterate, to be in constant frantic motion. But Munger argues the exact opposite. He argues that doing less, but doing it with immense concentration, rigorous preparation, and only acting when the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor is the actual secret to outperforming the majority. It challenges you to ask, where in your career or your life are you confusing frantic activity with effective progress?
That is a very powerful, uncomfortable question, and it leads us perfectly into the final major concept of the Almanack. Because Munger teaches us how to succeed, but his absolute favorite trick for success is actually studying how to fail. We have to talk about his 1986 commencement speech at the Harvard School. He was speaking to a bunch of graduating high school seniors, and instead of giving them the standard uplifting follow your dream speech, he gave them a roadmap to utter despair.
He was utilizing his core guiding principle, inversion. He borrowed this concept from the great 19th century German algebraist Carl Jacobi, whose motto was invert, always invert. Munger realized that many hard problems in life, like how to achieve lasting happiness or build a great business, are too complex to solve by charting a direct forward path. The variables are too chaotic. Instead, you must solve the problem backward. If you want to know how to be happy, study the behaviors that absolutely guarantee misery and failure and fiercely, relentlessly avoid them. For the speech, he borrowed 3 prescriptions for misery from the comedian Johnny Carson and then added 4 of his own.
I can just imagine him standing at the podium, looking at these hopeful teenagers, and delivering this deadpan list of ruin. The first 3 from Carson are pretty straightforward. Number 1, ingesting chemicals in an effort to alter mood or perception. Munger notes he watched some of the most brilliant people he ever knew systematically destroy their brains and their lives with alcohol and drugs. Number 2, envy. He points out that envy is the only deadly sin you can't even have any fun committing. It's just pure, agonizing self-destruction. And number 3, resentment.
Resentment is a big one for Munger. He quotes Samuel Johnson, saying life is hard enough without squeezing in the bitter rind of resentment. To illustrate how to handle it, he mentions Benjamin Disraeli, the great British Prime Minister. When Disraeli was wronged, instead of seeking active, time-consuming vengeance, he simply wrote the names of his enemies on pieces of paper and put them in a drawer. He let the natural forces of the world eventually take them down, while he focused his energy on productive work.
But Munger's additions to the list are where his unique worldview really shines. His 4th prescription for guaranteed misery is be unreliable. He told the students, if you like being distrusted and excluded from the best human contribution to company, this prescription is for you. He warned them that if they are unreliable, they will eventually be outrun in the race of life by hordes of mediocre turtles, or even mediocre turtles on crutches.
Mediocre turtles on crutches.
That is such a devastating, hilarious image, but doesn't he have a specific real-world example to back that up?
He does, and the underlying truth is profound. Munger had a college roommate who was severely dyslexic. Now, in the 1940s, being dyslexic was a massive, almost insurmountable handicap in academia. But this man possessed one overriding trait. He was extraordinarily fiercely reliable. If he said he would do something, it was done, period. That man went on to become the highly successful CEO of a major corporation. Munger uses him to prove that pure, unadulterated reliability can counteract almost any innate intellectual disadvantage.
His 5th prescription is learn only from your own personal experience and minimize what you learn vicariously from the good and bad experiences of others. He says this is a sure-shot producer of second-rate achievement. Why insist on making all the painful, expensive mistakes yourself when human history is full of people who have already made them for you? Read history. Read biographies.
That ties right back to his childhood obsession with Ben Franklin.
Exactly. His 6th prescription for misery. Go down and stay down after your 1st, 2nd, or 3rd severe reverse in the battle of life. He says because there is so much inevitable adversity out there, if you give up easily, you guarantee you will be permanently mired in misery.
And remember, Munger's own life here, walking the streets of Pasadena after losing his son. He knows about severe reverses. To illustrate this intellectual resilience, he quotes the epitaph of the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus. Here lies Epictetus, a slave, maimed in body, the ultimate in poverty, and favored by the gods. It is a stark testament to the fact that external circumstances do not have to dictate your internal triumph. Conversely, to warn against hubris, he quotes King Croesus, who was about to be burned alive on a pyre. No man's life should be accounted a happy one until it is over. It's a reminder of the sheer fragility of success.
And his final 7th prescription is my absolute favorite. He tells the students to actively ignore the story of the rustic farmer. The farmer says, "I wish I knew where I was going to die and then I'd never go there." Most people just laugh at the joke and move on. But Munger says ignoring the profound wisdom hidden in that joke guarantees misery. It is the ultimate folksy summary of inversion.
And why does inversion work so flawlessly as a mental model? Munger uses Charles Darwin to explain the mechanics of it. Darwin wasn't necessarily the smartest man of his era. He didn't have the highest IQ, but he had an incredible, rigorous working method. He always gave priority attention to evidence that tended to disconfirm his own cherished and hard-won theories.
He actively tried to destroy his own ideas.
Yes. Most ordinary people do the exact opposite. They fall in love with an idea, an investment, a political belief, a relationship, and they process new information only in a way that keeps their original conclusions intact. They ignore the red flags.
Yeah.
By actively seeking out disconfirming evidence, Darwin bypassed psychological denial and arrived at unshakable objective truths.
It's the complete opposite of confirmation bias. Inversion forces you to look at the dark side of your own beliefs. And as we've discussed, this isn't just a quirky speech technique to get a laugh at graduation. This is the fundamental operating system of Charlie Munger's brain. Avoid the fatal mistakes. Avoid the chemicals, the envy, the unreliability, the ideological blindness, and success naturally, inevitably fills the void that is left.
It is entirely a philosophy of subtraction rather than addition. You don't need brilliant, world-changing flashes of insight every single day. You just need to consistently avoid doing stupid things over a very long period of time.
So we've journeyed from his tough Midwestern childhood under Grandpa Ernest through his tragic personal losses. We've explored the necessity of building a multidisciplinary latticework of mental models, dissected the massive flaws in the psychology of human misjudgment, and learned how to invest and live by sitting patiently on our hands and inverting every hard problem. Let's synthesize all of this. What is the ultimate takeaway?
If we summarize the ultimate Munger approach, it rests firmly on 4 pillars: preparation, discipline, patience, and decisiveness. You must prepay for success through voracious reading and actively building your multidisciplinary models before you need them. You must have the rigorous discipline to stay strictly within your circle of competence, readily and humbly acknowledging what you don't know. You must have the psychological patience to wait for the rare, obvious opportunities, the fat pitches. And finally, when the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor, you must act with absolute conviction and decisiveness.
And the most important takeaway for you listening right now is that you absolutely do not need to be a billionaire hedge fund manager to use this toolkit. You don't need to be analyzing the intrinsic discounted cash flow of Coca-Cola. Whether you are trying to pick a new career path in the age of AI, navigating a difficult marriage, or just trying to run a local business, like being the best plumbing contractor in Bemidji, building this latticework of mental models will give you an incredible, unfair edge. Recognizing when you are caught in a Lollapalooza effect will save your wallet. Avoiding heavy ideology will keep your mind clear and adaptable. Inverting your problems will prevent catastrophic personal failures.
Knowledge is only truly valuable when it is deeply understood and practically applied. Munger's entire life is proof that there is always more to learn, and that synthesizing multiple perspectives is the only reliable way to navigate a deeply complex reality. In a modern world defined by constant, deafening information overload and algorithmic manipulation, Munger's brand of critical thinking and reliance on fundamental truths isn't just a strategy, it is a superpower.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to take away and mull over. We've spent a lot of time today talking about applying Munger's models to business and market psychology. We've talked about companies building moats and catching the wave of technological surfing like National Cash Register. But what if you applied his concepts of competitive destruction and ecosystems directly to your own personal life? Take a hard, objective look at your daily routines, your social circles, and your core assumptions. Which of your current habits is basically a buggy whip factory, an outdated mode of operating just waiting to be destroyed by a new phase of your life or shift in the world around you? And taking a page from Charles Darwin, are you willing to actively disconfirm your own cherished beliefs to find out what that buggy whip is before it's too late?
That is the ultimate challenge Munger leaves us with. It's not enough to simply acquire worldly wisdom and nod along to the anecdotes. You must have the courage to adjust your behavior accordingly, even if it makes you temporarily uncomfortable or unpopular.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary mind of Charlie Munger. We hope this conversation has given you the foundational tools to start building your own mental lattice work today.
Never stop learning. Never stop questioning your own assumptions. And above all else, invert. Always invert.